Hoje temos connosco Robert Kaplan, especialista em geopolítica, jornalista, autor, considerado pela Foreign Affairs como um dos 100 mais importantes pensadores. Vamos falar sobre as consequências da invasão russa da Ucrânia, da nova geopolítica global, mas também um bocadinho de Portugal. Robert Kaplan, welcome and thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
In the latest introduction of your book, The Revenge of Geography, the one published in Portugal, you mentioned Henry Adams, who said that Europe's central problem was and would always be Russia and its integration. Can this problem be solved? Does Russia will ever want to be part of Western Europe?
Well, Henry Adams was the great-grandson of the second American president, John Adams, the grandson of the sixth, John Quincy Adams, and was a brilliant, famous historian. And in 1907, he said, you know, Europe's problem is, will, and always will be Russia, because Russia is too big, too chaotic, not quite Western enough to be easily absorbed into the European family of nations. And I think what we're seeing now, therefore, with the war in Ukraine, is we're back in the groove of history as Henry Adams defined it. We see Russia again causing difficulty or being consequential to the future of Europe. However this war plays out, the problem of Russia will remain, because one of several things can happen. You know, there's an expression from Lenin that decades could go on and nothing happens. And then weeks and months go on and decades happen. And that's where we are right now. The next few weeks and months on the battlefield in Ukraine, the biggest war in Europe since 1945, will determine, you know, in many ways the future of Europe. If the Ukrainians are successful, or do well, capture a significant amount of what Russia had taken, we could see the demise of Vladimir Putin, or we could see a more intensified tyranny in Russia, or we could see and if he falls or eventually is replaced, we could see a more chaotic Russia, an even more nationalist Russia, or maybe a more liberal democratic Russia that will still be very unstable. So the problem of Russia is with Europe for the foreseeable future.
Looking from Europe, Ukraine is in a bad place. It's a plane between two large powers. Can you foresee a solution for this war? And if none of them wins the war, what will happen?
Well, with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. It's a great European-oriented empire that extends all the way across the Far East, half the longitudes of the earth. But without Ukraine, Russia is just a weak, unstable problem to the east of Europe with nuclear weapons. And so, as I said, the problem of Russia continues. And Europe will be facing this problem in the East in the years and decades to come, particularly the parts of Europe that are close to Russia. Poland south through Romania and Bulgaria, the Baltic states, Finland. All these are the real strong anti-Russian states of NATO.
We are seeing Germany investing in defense. A new thing, and is now proposing to be a long-term military power in Europe. Did Russian invasion awaken ancient ghosts in Germany or even in Poland?
The Russian invasion was a disaster for Russia in terms of Europe, because for decades, Germany was essentially a neutral power, though it would never admit it. It was getting cheap natural gas from Russia, it was being defended by the United States, and it was getting rich off trade with China. The Russian invasion, in other words, forced the Germans to choose. And they gave up Russian natural gas for the time being and have promised to increase their defense budget, which makes Germany more of a forceful component of the Atlantic Alliance, which is the opposite of everything that Vladimir Putin wanted.
Yeah. But do you think that Germany will have is keen to have a different role from now on? Or not only Germany, but Germany in the European Union?
I'm not so sure. I think the Germans, in their heart of hearts, partly for geographical reasons, would like to reconstitute the natural gas pipeline trade with Russia in some post-Putin Russia, or something like that. Because the Germans have always, remember, since in 1945, Germany was defeated, humiliated, was told it could never be a military power again. So the Germans became very aggressive in trade and in production, manufacturing. And that's where the Germans are today, very aggressive as a manufacturing power, wanting to move closer to China. Yeah.
Do you think it's feasible for political powers in Europe to tell their citizens, well, now you have to pay for defense. It's not United States anymore.
It's hard for Europeans because, look, it's an easy sell in Poland or the Baltic states or Romania, countries that have been invaded so often by Russia. To tell their citizens they have to pay more for defense is logical. It's easy. It's a bit harder in Germany and France. And I would assume it will, over the long term, be harder in the southern tier, from Portugal on the Atlantic to Greece on the Aegean, because those countries are much less affected by Russia and the threat it poses, and much more effective by long-term challenges like migration from Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, and in the case of Greece and Italy, migration from Middle East wars.
Before talking about migrations and the challenge for Europe, let me ask you about the consequences of this war. It was a surprise in most of terms. How did and forced us to look again in geopolitics. It's not over geopolitics. How did we get here? And has the post-Berlin Wall globalized world deceived us in any chance in looking, in these tension points around the globe?
In the first 20 years after the Cold War, many intellectuals thought that we had left geography and geopolitics behind. We were now in a globalized world where foreign policy was about humanitarian intervention. And I rejected this. That's why I wrote my book, The Revenge of Geography, which I wrote 13 years ago, actually. Because I said there's another half of the story. And the other half of the story was the map. And not only the map, but natural resources, cultures, demography, climate change, all of those things which would affect international relations, not always in a good way. So I think that the initial post-Cold War generation was deceived or deceived itself, and now we're back to reality. With this war, which, as I said, is the largest war in Europe since World War II. And we had a little dose of reality with the Balkans in the 1990s, but that was not quite enough to, people said, well, that's a special circumstance, so to speak. No, I was having none of that.
Do you think that this is the new world? The new geopolitics?
The new geopolitics is complex. On the one hand, the world is smaller. Geography has shrunk. The world is more anxious, more claustrophobic, more interconnected, with crises in one part of the earth able to affect other parts of the earth as never before. So in that sense, old-fashioned geography is weakened, but it is still strong enough to have its effect in many parts of the world. Just for an example, Taiwan is almost 100 miles away from the Chinese mainland. If it were only 20 miles away, like the width of the English Channel, well then, the mainland Chinese would have invaded and conquered Taiwan back in the 1950s. And so geography matters, and it's so obvious that people tend to discount it.
Do you think that the international order that came from World War II is exhausted, and we are witnessing an attempt to adjust the balance of powers between all these new actors
I
in some
don't
cases?
think it's exhausted. I think the invasion of Ukraine has given it new life. Because remember, NATO was always about defending against Russia or the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And in the 1990s, the 2010s, when Russia was relatively weak, NATO had less of a purpose. But now with the invasion of Ukraine, NATO has more of a purpose, and this is the survival of the post-World War II order. But it's more complex than it used to be, because in the Cold War, the Soviet Union had no economy to speak of, so that European countries, for a simple fact of life, did their trade with North America and the Far East with Japan. Now we're in a world where Europe is somewhat between China and the United States, because the United States can survive without trade with China because it's a big enough economy on its own to generate buyers and sellers. But Europe, individual European countries require China for their prosperity. So it's going to be a more complicated alliance.
It's not black and white. The integration makes that geopolitics being different around the world. Economic integration, also political integration in some cases, like South America or even around South China Sea. Do you think it's...
Yeah, the Chinese are very active in South America, extremely active. And we're, in an economic sense, we're really in a global world in terms of trade. Remember, Russia is not so much an economy, but a petrostate. And if it can't sell its hydrocarbons, its principal natural resources, it's really nothing. So, the future of Russia is dismal for the time being. But if you look at India, if you look at other countries, you see middle-level powers rising up to challenge some of the weaker great powers.
We are seeing the Western world imposing sanctions against Russia, but only the Western world. The rest is refusing to go along. This is a sign that this is a war, an ancient war between NATO and Russia that can be a thing of Europe and not of the world, of the whole world. It's a war constrained to Europe and will not affect directly.
Well, it does affect the world. Look at the stoppage of grain deliveries because of the Ukraine war that has affected stability in Egypt, in many other countries. We're seeing second and third order effects because of the nature of the interconnectedness of the global economy. So that regional wars can still be regional, but they have an effect outside their regions as never before.
Looking to Europe, we can see a tension between, as you said earlier, aging demographics and populism, and migration is an issue. Can this shape the way ahead and the relations between Europe and the Middle East and even with Eastern Europe?
Remember, Europe does not have oceans on each side of it. It's not protected to the extent that the temperate zone of North America is protected. Europe is close to the Middle East, it's close to North Africa, it's close to sub-Saharan Africa. And all those places, although world population is declining, population in those places is still rising far ahead that of indigenous Europe. And so what that leads to is there'll be constant migration pressure on Europe in the through the course of the 21st century. Europe's crisis now is in the East, but its ongoing page 2 or page 3 crisis is in the South and the Southeast.
In a more multipolar world, how do you look to movements like the BRICS? Can they be relevant in geopolitical as a group? Having such diverse interests, each one?
Well, you said it. Their interests are very diverse. So I don't see them as being relevant as a group, except in a very superficial way. I mean, India and Brazil may both be BRICS, but they have almost nothing in common. Their politics are different. Their geography is different. India is right on the border with China.
Yeah.
Which means it has to be tough against China, but it also cannot afford a big war with China. India is close to Russia because Russia impinges on Afghanistan, and India's national interest going back hundreds and going back centuries, in fact, has been has extended as far as Afghanistan, whereas Brazil is completely different. Brazil is in South America. It's not part of the Eurasian struggle that is now emerging with Russia weakening and China strengthening.
We talked about Eurasia. What can we see looking to the Atlantic and especially to the South Atlantic in this new geopolitical world?
Well, Portugal, is often mistaken as a Mediterranean country, but of course it's not. It's an Atlantic country, and but it's close to the Mediterranean, and it's also close to Brazil through language, and it's in that sense close to Latin America in some sense. Europe is Portugal. Excuse me. Portugal has part European and with deep roots in South America. So it's kind of a small global player, in other words, or can be. But its population is relatively small, its power is limited, so it can only maximize its importance through brilliant diplomacy.
And convincing Europe or the United States of his importance especially in the South Atlantic. Do you think Africa can play a role in here? We have deep roots in
Africa will be critical for Europe because of migration. And I don't just mean failed states. I mean new middle-class states in Africa that will generate first and second generations of the middle class who have a likelihood to want to migrate too, for different reasons than people in poor, failing states. So I think the demographic push is northward from Africa into Europe.
Robert, one last question. From your knowledge, can a language-based project like the one we have with the Portuguese-speaking countries be international relevant? What conditions must a project like this have to succeed?
Portugal was a great empire. It had colonies or territories in South America, in Southern Africa for the most part, a little bit in the Far East. It was truly a globe-spanning empire at the dawn of the modern age, at the end of the early modern age. All those places are very relevant today. So Portugal can punch above its weight because of its linguistic strength. The Portuguese language is spoken both in Africa and in Latin America and elsewhere. So it has soft power. The question is, how do you maximize that?
Robert Kaplan, thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Obrigado também a quem nos acompanhou. Esta entrevista pode ser lida na edição impressa do Novo, continuará disponível em onovo.pt e em jornaleconómico.pt, onde poderá também acompanhar as últimas notícias da atualidade. Até uma próxima oportunidade.